Hey everybody, welcome back. We are here to do a quick review of a book that I finished. And what book is that? You're probably asking yourself. It is, of course, Stephen King's Firestarter. Just finished the book a little while ago. And one of the things, there's a lot that I liked about this. I want to get that right on the table right away. I enjoyed this book a lot, as I usually do with Stephen King. I find that King is an enjoyable writer. You know, he, like every other writer, some of his books are going to be fantastic, some of his books are going to be less fantastic, but he's always at least fun to read. And I think that a lot of what we see in most modern King has really been laid out in some of his earliest books, like we saw Carrie before and Firestarter now. So Firestarter is several books after Carrie, and it takes place kind of in a similar time. Part of me really wished that King had linked the two stories together, because at the end of Carrie, we have all these government panels kind of talking about what happened to Carrie White and what happened in her town, and trying to understand how are we going to deal with a world where it is possible that people will have genetic traits that give them telekinetic powers. And people were genuinely afraid. And I think that issue, that aspect of Carrie, really could have carried over very well into this book if that had been something that King had been interested in doing, which I don't think he was at the time. He hadn't quite started putting the King universe together quite as yet, I think. That was still a bit in the future, definitely with The Dark Tower. But nevertheless, this book does involve government overreach. It involves a government organization called the Shop, who is doing some experiments with psychedelic drugs, trying to induce telekinetic powers or special powers, right? Special mental psionic powers. And for the most part, it fails. Most of they pay a bunch of college students to take these drugs and see what happens. A couple of them die in a lab or go crazy in the lab. Some of them commit suicide later, but only this couple, the McGees, survive. Not only survive, they do well. They both have their own powers. She has minor telekinetic powers. He has the ability to kind of influence people's thoughts and behaviors. And they have a child, little Charlie McGee, and everything seems fine. But when the Shop discovers that their program was not a complete failure, that not only did two of their subjects survive, but they had a child that passed down the powers, they become very interested in them. And that begins the novel, where they're chasing down Charlie and her father. So, yeah, I think King could have made this fit into the Carrieverse, as it were, if he had set it maybe after the events of Carrie, maybe if he had set it so that the Shop existed as a result of what happened to Carrie White and existed in order to try to induce powers like hers on people that could then be used by the U.S. government for its own nefarious ends. However, that's not what he did. So we kind of have to, as much as I want that to be what King did, he did not do it, and I'm going to just spend the rest of my life wishing he had, but he didn't. And we have to accept the book as it is, not the book as we want it to be, because that's how literature works. So, what did we get from this? I think when we talked about this last, we did What Are We Reading? The characters had found themselves captured by the Shop. They were imprisoned. Andy is now drugged. He is basically kind of without his powers for the most part. Charlie doesn't know where her dad is, and she's being manipulated by this horribly, grotesquely maimed guy named John Rainbird. And I posited that Andy probably wouldn't survive the book, and I was right. But I think he didn't survive the book much better than I thought he would. He played a very important part. He was not wasted. And that is, again, a kind of a good King trait, is that his characters are not wasted. His characters, when he introduces a character and he gives us their point of view, he puts them through something, that is there for a reason. It exists for a purpose. And he is very good at making sure that if he's requiring the reader to care about a character, then he's going to make it pay off. And I think he did with Andy. Andy does leave the narrative in a good way that helps advance the story. I mean, by advance the story, I mean create a horrifying firestorm that kills multiple people. But nevertheless, he does help his daughter to kind of push herself out of this place that she's in. So I think Andy's fate went well. I think the way that it was written, the big sort of flaming conflagration at the shop headquarters was beautiful, honestly. It was a really, really nicely written piece of work, the way that she just... And I say this, when I say beautiful, I mean it in the most grotesque of ways, because we got people being electrocuted by electric fences. We have a car being turned basically, as it's driven, being turned basically into just a lump of metal. We've got the horses on fire. We've got all that stuff. But it is mesmerizing to read. And as is so often the case with King, it's really hard to stop and put the book down because you want to know where it's going. And then, of course, even that kind of big climactic moment isn't the end of the book. Charlie does manage to escape now with nobody. She has no mother, no father. She has no protectors. But she does manage to escape. She manages to find support, and she manages to... The book leaves us with her walking into the offices of Rolling Stone in New York City, and that's an interesting choice, prepared to tell her story to whomever will listen and presumably demonstrate what she can do. And that's where the story ends. And so we're left with a bit of hope that Charlie's revelation of what she can do, that she can, her revelation about the shop and the people who put her and her father through the hell that they went through, will hopefully result in something better. So, as is so often the case with any book that we read, we want to ask ourselves, all right, what did we learn from this book? And I saw a fun little snippet from, I think, Tumblr someplace that read the following. It says, sometimes fiction doesn't have a moral to the story. Sometimes fiction points at something and goes, ever thought about that? And you look at what it's pointing at for a bit. And I think a lot of King's works are kind of like that. It's like, hey, have you ever thought about this? Like, what would happen if somebody could start fires with their mind? Wow, that'd be nuts. And it is pretty nuts. But I still think we can kind of say, what is this story about? And I think what this story is about, if we were to really, really, really distill it down to the most sort of very, very basic element, is the story is about control. Charlie, most obviously, has to learn how to control what is a horrifying power. And every time she uses it, the power is almost personified. She talks about it like the power wants to do this. The power tries to do the other thing. It's a thing that she doesn't know how to make do what she wants, of course, until the end, where she has a much greater ability to take it in hand. And so, yeah, for Charlie, this book is all about control, learning how to control this wild power within herself. And if we wanted to be figurative about this, if we wanted to use this as a metaphor, then certainly this is, maybe we could take a little sidestep and say, okay, well, this is kind of a growing up story, right? That as we grow up, as we, age into adolescence, there's a lot going on within ourselves. There's thoughts and hormones and experiences and everything that we don't know how to control. That's why a lot of teenagers are frankly insane, because their bodies are doing things to them that they're not prepared for, that they're not ready for, and they don't have the life experience to know how to, what impulses they should follow and what impulses they should disregard. And so that's why it's so easy for young people to kind of get themselves into big trouble. It's because they don't have that experience. And unfortunately for little Charlie McGee, her experience comes at great cost. But she, like all of us, has to learn to control the raging flames within and hopefully put them to good use rather than to destructive use. Her father is also about control, because his power is literally the ability to control people's minds, right? He, when the kind of before the book begins, he had made a living in New York City as kind of a counselor, or I think the most recent movie, he refers to himself as a life coach, where people come to him with a problem. They want to quit smoking, they want to lose weight, they want to be better at work. And he would talk to them like a counselor, and then at some point he would just use his power and go, you don't need to smoke cigarettes anymore. And they'd be like, yeah, you know what, I don't need to smoke cigarettes anymore. And so he has a frightening ability as well, not in the same way as Charlie's, but he can make people do things. At one point, he makes a person go blind just by telling him, you're blind now. He has extraordinary control over other people's minds, but even that is not absolute. There are times where his ability to push people causes these, he refers to them as ricochets, where the thing that he asks them to do is somehow linked to something else. And there becomes this weird kind of feedback in their own mind, which eventually leads to madness or death. So even though Andy is kind of an emblem of somebody who takes control of other people, it's still not absolute. It's still not something he can completely control. And, is it right for him to get into people's minds and tell them you want to lose weight or, you don't want sweets anymore without their consent? No, not really. But you kind of have to say, well, of all the things he could be doing with his power, that's probably one of the nicest things he could be doing with his power. So, all right. There's arguments to be made there. And then, of course, the last sort of major axis of control of the book is the government, is the shop, which is a clandestine U.S. government agency that exists specifically to control people, to find people with remarkable abilities or powers or whatnot, and bend them to the services of the U.S. government. And with King writing this in the 70s, it's no surprise that, of course, he's going to put a shadowy government agency at the heart of this, because shadowy government agencies are very active in the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and 2010s and 2020s, and all the time. They're always a shadowy U.S. government agency, guys. There's always one. But yeah, the shop's desire to see Charlie not as a human being, not as a 10-year-old girl, but as a thing to be controlled, is part of the heart of this book. If the shop didn't want to control people in that way, then the story wouldn't happen. Charlie and her father and her mother would have lived perfectly ordinary, happy lives. But they didn't, because government's going to government. And it leads me to a line from Terry Pratchett that he would write much later, many years after this. But Pratchett, in I think at least a couple of books, he made this kind of statement that evil begins when we treat people as things. And in that sense, yeah, the shop is being evil. The shop is treating Charlie like a thing to be controlled, like a thing to be directed, like a weapon to be used at their discretion. And they forget that she is a child. She's a child who never wanted any of this. She never wanted these powers. She never wanted any of the chaos that has come into her life. She's a kid. She probably wants what every 10-year-old girl wants, to hang out with horses and stuff, which she does get to do in the book. She gets to hang out with horses, but even that comes at a cost. So, should you read Firestarter? I think you really should. I think there are some wonderfully evocative scenes in there. There's a whole set of scenes where Charlie and Andy are at the shop headquarters and the power cuts out, and King has to write these scenes that are completely in the dark, and they are kind of freaky and a little scary, right? Andy having this mounting panic attack as there's no light, he can't see anything, he's convinced he's going to die in this room because no one's going to come check on him. Again, King is very evocative as a writer. And so yeah, it's a fun read, it's an easy read, it's not going to take you terribly long to get through it. And I think you should read it. It is one of King's foundational works. If you're interested in reading him, you should read this book. There we go. Full stop. I strongly endorse this book. That'll get King's name on the map. But anyway, so those are my thoughts on Firestarter. If you have read Firestarter and you would like to include your thoughts, please let me know. I would love to hear them. See if there are any other sort of lessons that you gleaned from reading it. In the meantime, if you have not yet subscribed, I would greatly appreciate it if you would. Because I like seeing numbers go up. Seeing numbers go up is cool, and I can't do the push thing that Adam does with his mind. I can't get into your brain and make you subscribe. So I just have to ask politely. But other than that, thank you all very much. I appreciate you sticking around, and we'll be back for the next book that I finish, whichever book that happens to be. So take care.